In the quiet heart of Kansas, Thanksgiving weekend is supposed to be easy. Casseroles cooling on counters, football humming from living rooms, small towns that go dim early because everyone's inside with family. Burlingame is one of those towns, tree-lined, neighborly, a place where you remember to wave back. On the edge of it stood a comfortable home that belonged to Dorothy White, an 89-year-old grandmother who kept traditions with the kind of stubborn kindness that holds a family together. That's where her granddaughter Karen Kaler brought the kids for the holiday of 2009. Emily, 18, Lauren, 16, and Sean, 10. Their father, James Craig Kaler, was not invited. Everyone knew why. If you'd met the Kalers a few years earlier, you might have filed them under solid. Craig, he went by his middle name, was an engineer, the kind of resume that buys you trust. He'd worked his way into big utility jobs, most recently running a city's water and light department. Karen was gracious and social, the family's connective tissue, the one who kept holidays and birthdays on time. The girls mirrored her, Emily precise and responsible, Lauren quick with warmth and sarcasm, both close to their little brother. Both the kind of teenagers who still checked in from wherever they were with texts that said "here" and "love you." But a family can look fine from the street and still be breaking apart inside. The marriage had been failing for years, the kind of slow collapse that starts with nights on different sides of a bed and ends with silence in rooms that used to hold easy conversation. Craig lost his grip first where it always shows, at work. In 2008, after months of conflict and a reputation dented by personal problems, he resigned from his city job. Friends saw a man scraping pride off the floor. Karen tried to build a safer distance. Separation papers grew real. There was talk, true talk, about Karen's new relationship, and whatever dignity Craig had left buckled. He blamed her for a public fall he didn't know how to wear in private. By the fall of 2009, the split was formal enough that Thanksgiving wasn't a negotiation. Karen would take the children to Dorothy's house in Burlingame. They'd spend the weekend in a place that felt safe, warm light, the smell of something sweet in the oven, a grandmother who still fussed over whether everyone had enough to eat. There was a plan to string lights. There were stories to catch up on. Emily had just started college. Lauren had friends to text and music to share on tinny phone speakers. Sean had 10-year-old energy to burn racing up and down hallways he'd known his whole life. When Saturday, November 28th came, the day moved on soft, ordinary feet. You can still picture the details because every family shares them. A stray sock on the stairs, a glass left sweating by the sink, the late afternoon sky going pewter behind bare branches. Karen texted a friend. Emily was half in a conversation, half in her own head the way first-semester freshmen are. Lauren drifted upstairs with the light. Dorothy moved between kitchen and living room, satisfied by the simple satisfaction of her people at home. And then, sometime after dark, the quiet was broken by the person they'd tried to leave behind. Craig came to the house with a rifle and a grievance he had been rehearsing for weeks. He had told people he was unraveling. He had told some he might go out in a blaze of glory. He had lost status, and then he lost his wife, and then he lost the version of himself that knew how to be without those things. And when the day came that he chose to act, he chose the most intimate theater of violence, a family home in a small town, at a holiday, with children inside. Neighbors would remember the shape of that night in pieces. Sirens rising where sirens hardly ever go. A child pounding across a yard to beg for help. A call about shots fired that lit up radios across Osage County. Deputies arrived in the house within minutes. What they found was a scene that still leaves professionals searching for steady words. Karen, Emily, and Dorothy were down, shot at close range. Lauren, mortally wounded upstairs, was still breathing. In those brutal, sacred minutes before paramedics took over, she whispered the sentence that would anchor everything that followed. Her father had done this. Sean survived because children sometimes carry a survival instinct adults forget they ever had. He ran when he needed to run. He found a neighbor. He forced the night to become public. And that is why this story has a witness who didn't learn it from paperwork. By midnight, the house was sealed under light and tape. Investigators moved through it with the measured speed of people who know they are walking both a crime scene and a family's last ordinary belongings. Bullet paths and casings told a sequence. The rifle, a .223 caliber semi-automatic prosecutors would later argue was his, was not recovered. That absence became part of the story too, a gap the state would fill with forensics and testimony. Karen's body lay near the main floor. Dorothy was down in her own home on her own holiday. The girls were close enough to break your heart twice. This was not an accident. This was not a frenzy. This was a man moving room to room with an intent he had already chosen. The manhunt began that night and bled into the next morning. Patrol cars and K-9 units fanning through Osage and Shawnee counties, officers watching ditch lines in case a weapon had been tossed, quiet roads suddenly patrolled like borders. The suspect had left on foot, then by car, then... No one was sure. It didn't matter. His name went out. His description went out. His history started to catch up behind them. The high-profile job lost. The marriage dissolved. The resentment that had boiled over into threats. He was found the next day, not far from the county line, alive, silent. Arrested without shots fired. Kansas charged him with the heaviest thing it can charge: capital murder. The state would say this was not the hot burn of a stranger's crime. It was the cold arithmetic of a man who had planned to erase the people who proved he no longer had control. Friends and family would fill in the missing hours. The deterioration of a marriage. The way anger and humiliation can teach a certain kind of man to turn victims into symbols. The warning comments no one wants to believe are serious until they turn out to be. But that comes later: trial, testimony, the slow arrangement of facts into a public sentence. Part 1 belongs to the house on a Kansas street the Saturday after Thanksgiving. When a grandmother was doing what grandmothers do, a mother was trying to make a new life. 2 daughters were stretching toward their futures, and a son found the only door left and ran through it. If you remember just one thing from this beginning, remember their names in order, because order is the only dignity left when violence tries to take everything. Dorothy White, 89. Karen Kaler, 44. Emily, 18. Lauren, 16. And Sean, whose job became survival, so the rest of us could know what happened. This is where the telling starts. In the next part, we'll walk into the investigation, the 911 calls and the first deputy through the door, the search that found the suspect, the charging decisions, and the first hints of a legal fight that would stretch all the way to the United States Supreme Court years later. For now, hold this picture. A winter night in Burlingame, a family that did not get the holiday they deserved, and a town that learned how fast ordinary can be stolen. When the first deputy stepped into the house on November 28, 2009, he stepped out of ordinary time. The front door swung into a space he would never forget. The stillness that follows gunfire. The kind of silence that has to be read instead of heard. He cleared one room, then the next, moving fast and careful, naming what he saw into the radio, because names are how chaos becomes a plan. On the main floor lay Karen, shot at close range. Nearby, Dorothy White, 89 years old, was down in the home she had filled with holidays for decades. Upstairs, in a bedroom that used to hear laughter and assignment chatter, Lauren was mortally wounded and still breathing. There are sentences you never want to carry for a lifetime. The deputy asked the question the job requires. Lauren's answer was soft and exact. her father. In those seconds, the case had a center. It would take months to reach a verdict, years to reach the end of appeals. But the truth in that room didn't need a calendar. Outside, Osage County lit up. Dispatch pushed additional units to the scene and pushed the description of the suspect out beyond the county line. The manhunt began in widening circles. First the grid around Burlingame, then the roads that branched toward Shawnee County, then the ditch lines and tree rows where a rifle could be tossed and never seen again. Neighbors left porch lights on without being asked. People leaned in doorways with phones ready. The same question jumped across kitchens and squad cars and radio repeaters. Where is he? Inside the house, responders did the disciplined work that sits beside tragedy. Stabilize who can be stabilized. Protect what cannot be saved. Mark what must be measured. Emily was gone. Karen was gone. Dorothy clung to life long enough for the law to say attempted, where it would soon say a more final word. Lauren fought the only fight left to her, and then that fight ended too. The floor plan of a family home, entry, hallway, living room, stairs, had become a map of how a man moved through it with a rifle and a decision. The suspect, James Craig Kaler, was not at the scene. He had arrived, done what he came to do, and left. The first hours after that kind of exit belong to checklists that run on muscle memory. Set perimeters. Call in K9. Request air support if the weather allows. Ask for traffic units to watch for a vehicle that matches his. Push his description and last. Known to every patrol car in earshot. Assign a search coordinator who keeps the picture unified as tips begin to pour in. And they did. Some vague, some sharp. A sighting on a county road. A parked car with a door ajar. A figure on foot leaving a hedged-in property. Deputies and troopers checked them all. Kaler's life began following them back. In call-outs and whispers, a biography assembled itself. Former city utilities director, separated from his wife. Status lost in 2008. A marriage broken further by Karen's new relationship. Talk, over weeks, of despair tipping into revenge. The kind of threat people hope is just a tantrum until it isn't. An engineer's mind wrapped around a grievance. A holiday chosen because holidays put all your targets under one roof. By dawn, the search line had stretched north toward the Osage-Shawnee County line, out near Auburn Road and the fringe where farmland and suburbs blur. That's where officers found him, alive, cold, and wearing the night he'd made. He did not run. He did not explain. He was arrested and moved under guard. The manhunt ended with cuffs, not shots. Back in Burlingame, the house became two places at once, a crime scene and a home that would never be a home again. Evidence techs began the long harvest. Casings, bullet paths plotted against drywall and banisters, footwear impressions and blood patterns that fix the direction and pace of a shooter. The expected weapon, a .223 caliber semi-automatic rifle prosecutors would later link to Kaler by ownership and pre-purchase behavior, was missing. Investigators expanded their search to ditches, culverts, and creek beds along likely exit routes. Nothing turned up. That absence hardened into part of the narrative. The killer disposed of the gun with forethought or carried out a plan that didn't require the police ever to recover it. The charging phase moved as quickly as the facts allowed. Within days, prosecutors filed capital murder, the Kansas charge reserved for killings that meet specific aggravating criteria. They also filed, in the alternative, first-degree murder counts and an initial attempted first-degree charge tied to Dorothy while she fought for her life. When she died, the filing updated to reflect what everyone already knew in their bones. 4 people had been killed in a single, targeted sweep. There was also aggravated burglary because he entered a place where he had no right to be, with a weapon and with intent. Detectives spent the winter turning the rawness of that night into a case that could walk into court without stumbling. They built a timeline tight enough to leave no room for fancy. Phone records charted pings through the counties as the suspect circled toward Burlingame. Witnesses placed him near the house that evening. Sean, 10 years old, told what he had seen and done: the sounds, the run, the neighbor, the call. The deputy who found Lauren spoke about what she said. Later, on the stand, he would repeat the words that made the courtroom hold its breath. The state did not need to prove why. Kansas law requires intent, not a philosophical motive. But the context mattered. Friends, relatives, and former colleagues built a portrait of a man who had been humiliated in public and chose to answer in private with a rifle. Kaler's lawyers saw the same picture and began sketching the argument they would carry all the way to Washington, D.C. Mental illness, major depression, obsessive spirals in the months before the murders, a man coming apart at the seams. In many states, that history would support an insanity defense framed around a person's ability to know right from wrong at the moment he acted. Kansas is different. Since the mid-1990s, the state has limited what insanity can do in a trial. A defendant may present evidence of mental disease to show he lacked the required intent when he pulled the trigger. He cannot be acquitted simply because he could not appreciate the moral wrongfulness of what he did. That line, drawn by statute, would become the legal battlefield later. In the winter after the murders, it was a procedural note with enormous consequences. Meanwhile, the forensics filled in the edges. Ballistics matched recovered casings to a class of weapon consistent with the state's theory. Gunshot residue patterns supported close-range firing. Bloodstain pattern analysis told the awful truth about sequence. Karen first in the downstairs flow. Shots delivered with calm. Movement toward Dorothy, then up the stairs. The scene read like a route, not a struggle. Whatever conversation happened inside the shooter's head ended before he reached the front steps. The community did what communities do when December turns cruel. Churches opened and stayed open. A line formed at the funeral home that had served Osage County for generations. People filing past with casseroles and envelopes, and the kind of quiet that says more than speeches. 2 schools. One that had watched Emily graduate and wave goodbye to a first fall of college, another that expected Lauren back after break, held assemblies you cannot rehearse for. Teachers stood steadier than they felt. Friends found words for yearbook pages and posters and the small, stubborn memorials teenagers make when it's too soon to know what else helps. In court, the early hearings were brisk. Bond was set beyond reach. Arraignment came with 2 words: not guilty, because that is how the process works, even on days when rooms full of people want something simpler. A gag order trimmed the edges of what could be said in public, so the case could breathe in private without turning into a nightly show. The judge set a schedule that respected grief without letting it govern the calendar. Jurors would be summoned from a county that already knew too much. Questions would probe how to find 12 people able to hear the facts without hearing only their own fear. By spring, the file had the shape it needed. A survivor child who had done exactly what survival required. A dying declaration that courts have trusted for centuries. Physical evidence that tracked the bullets through a house and attached them to a shooter's path. History that explained the day without excusing it. The defense's lane narrowed to what Kansas law allows: argue state of mind at the level of intent and later argue mental illness at sentencing. The prosecution's lane was stark. 4 people were shot to death in a plan executed with speed and control. Nothing about the night could be made right. The point was to make it clear. When summer came, the state was ready to try a case that had begun on a holiday when a family had done nothing more provocative than show up for each other. The man in the defense chair had been a husband, a father, a professional entrusted with public resources. The law would ask a jury to decide whether, on one November night, he became something else by choice. Not by collapse, not by accident, not by fate, by choice. Jury selection in a small Kansas county has its own. Gravity. Almost everyone knew the headlines. Many knew the family. The judge's questions came steady and kind. Can you set aside what you've heard? Listen to witnesses you might recognize? Look at photographs no one should have to see? And decide only on the evidence. 12 people said yes and meant it as much as anyone can. They took the oath. The door closed. A life opened on the lectern. The prosecution began without drama. They didn't need adjectives. They had a map. Thanksgiving weekend, 2009. A warm house in Burlingame. 4 people shot at close range. A 10-year-old running across a yard. A suspect found the next day. They promised the jury structure. First the timeline, then the forensics, then the voices, some living, one dying, that would anchor intent. The first responders set the tone. The deputy who entered the house described a silence that read like a paragraph. He cleared one room, then another. He found Karen. He found Dorothy. He climbed the stairs. In a bedroom he'd later avoid in his memory if he could, he found Lauren. He told the jury he asked the question the job requires and repeated the answer that has its own legal weight. My father. He spoke it without flourish, the way truth deserves to be spoken. The judge told the jurors how to hold that sentence. As a dying declaration, an exception to hearsay the law has trusted for centuries, to be weighed like any other piece of evidence, carefully, soberly, with your whole attention. Neighbors followed, a porch light clicking on. A child at the door, Sean, breathless and exact. The 911 recording played, a voice on the edge of panic finding clarity because other lives needed it. Officers who took custody of the scene walked the jury through photographs not to shock, but to place. Entryway, hall, living room, stairs. The geometry of a house turned into a route by a man with a rifle. The state's forensic pathologist kept it clinical. Close-range gunshot wounds to Karen, Emily, Dorothy, and Lauren. Trajectories consistent with a shooter moving with calm and purpose. No struggle, no defensive wounds that would suggest a fight that went back and forth. Whatever argument had lived in the shooter's head didn't make it into the rooms where the bullets were delivered. Firearms and crime scene analysts charted the mechanics. 223 caliber casings recovered from the house, class consistent with a semi-automatic rifle the defendant owned and had been seen with in the months before the murders. The weapon itself was never found. The prosecutors didn't hide that. They turned the absence into arithmetic. Disposal requires forethought. Forethought speaks to premeditation. Bloodstain patterns and bullet paths traced a sequence. Downstairs first, then Dorothy, then the stairwell, and the hall above. The pattern read like a checklist. No fumbling, no hesitation. Just a series of choices carried through. The state filled in the hours before the killings. Cell site. Evidence placed Craig Kaler's phone moving toward Burlingame. Witnesses saw his vehicle in the vicinity. A neighbor noticed a shape crossing a yard not long before Sean appeared at his door. A relative testified about strain and threats in the months leading up to Thanksgiving. Phrases that sounded theatrical when they were spoken and literal when they were fulfilled. When it was the defense's turn, they didn't argue geography. They argued mind. They brought in mental health professionals who had evaluated Kaler after his arrest. The witnesses spoke of major depressive disorder, suicidal ideation, obsessive focus on the collapse of his marriage, humiliation after losing his public post, and spirals that had eaten sleep and appetite and judgment. Family acquaintances described a man coming apart in plain sight, weight lost, routines abandoned, a vocabulary shrinking to grievance and despair. In many states, this is the doorway to a familiar argument. Insanity by the right and wrong test. But this was Kansas, and the judge gave the jury a crucial instruction. Our law does not permit a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity on the ground that the defendant could not appreciate the moral wrongfulness of his acts. You may, the judge said, Consider mental disease or defect, insofar as it bears on whether the defendant formed the required intent. If the state proves premeditation and intent beyond a reasonable doubt, mental illness that leaves a person knowing what he's doing and that it's a crime is not a legal excuse. So the defense narrowed the plea, not that Kaler didn't know killing was wrong, but that his illness destroyed his capacity to premeditate, that this was a break, not a plan. They emphasized the whirlwind of the day, the collapse of a man's identity, the possibility that, in that storm, intent dissolved into impulse. The state answered by returning to the sequence and choices. He came at night when all were together. He brought a rifle chambered for speed. He moved room to room. He left the scene. He evaded capture for hours. He disposed of the weapon in a way that has kept it missing to this day. Those are not the footprints of a mind unable to intend. They are the marks of a mind carrying out a decision. The most difficult witness was the youngest. Sean took the stand, small in a big room, and told the jury about the sounds that tore the house open, the run across a yard that felt too long, the porch where a neighbor opened a door and turned a child's terror into a 911 call. His testimony did not aim to convince, it aimed to exist. The jurors looked at their notepads because sometimes that is how you let a child keep a little privacy in a place where privacy is impossible. Closing arguments drew their lines with different ink. The defense asked the jury to see a collapse, a father unstitched by illness and humiliation, not a blueprint. They asked for the mercy of reasonable doubt on intent. The prosecution asked for the discipline of common sense. This was not an explosion, it was execution. The law doesn't require a letter on a kitchen table or a villain's monologue. It requires that you recognize a plan when you see one. The judge's instructions were precise. Premeditation in Kansas can be formed in a short time. It does not mean days of plotting, only that a decision to kill was made before the act and carried through with reflection, not sudden heat. Consider each count separately. Weigh the dying declaration with care. Consider mental health evidence only as it bears on intent, not as a categorical excuse. Deliberations took hours, not weeks. The jury returned with a verdict that rearranged the room. Guilty of capital murder for the killings at the Burlingame home and of the associated counts. Faces in the gallery changed. Relief and ruin mixed in equal parts. Because guilty doesn't heal, it orders. The case moved to sentencing, the phase where Kansas asks jurors to weigh aggravating and mitigating factors and decide whether death is warranted. The state presented aggravators you could feel in your bones. Multiple victims, including a child, murdered in a single course. Killings carried out with particular vulnerability and betrayal of trust. A community shocked to its core. A surviving child whose life was bent by what he saw and what he lost. The defense put on the mitigating case they had previewed. A life of work and family before the collapse. Major depression and mental illness that, while not exculpatory under Kansas law, weighed against ultimate punishment. The argument that mercy is not the same as excuse. Jurors listened to more witnesses and read more reports than any citizen should have to. Then they did the arithmetic the law demands and returned with a recommendation: death. The judge, after the required independent review, imposed that sentence. James Craig Kaler was sent to Kansas death row. Appeals began immediately, as they must in capital cases. The Kansas Supreme Court reviewed the record years later and affirmed the convictions and sentence, rejecting challenges to the instructions, to the sufficiency of evidence on intent and premeditation, and to the state's capital scheme. Then the defense carried the one argument designed to outlive state law, that Kansas's narrow insanity framework itself violated the U.S. Constitution. by allowing conviction of someone who could not tell right from wrong. In 2020, the United States Supreme Court answered no. In a 6-3 decision, the court held that states may limit insanity to the absence of mens rea, criminal intent, and are not required by due process to retain the moral incapacity test. The ruling did not undo the verdict or the sentence. It settled the doctrine and left the facts where the jury had placed them. That is where the legal spine lands. A house mapped by bullet paths, a daughter's last words, a son's run for help, a prosecution built on sequence and choice, a defense that could not turn illness into legal innocence under Kansas law, a verdict that said the quiet part out loud, he meant to do it, and a sentence the state rarely seeks and rarer still carries out. Courtrooms end with sentences. Families don't. After the verdict and the judge's words sent James Craig Kaler to death row, Kansas did what the law requires, boxed the case in records and calendars and reviews, but the people inside the case had to learn how to live with a new kind of calendar entirely. Funerals came first, as they always do, forcing a community to say names out loud in rooms where saying them made people cry. Dorothy White, the grandmother who made holidays possible by sheer force of kindness. Karen, a daughter and mother trying to restart her life in the open after years of trying to hold it together behind closed doors. Emily, 18, new to college, the big sister gravity for 2 younger siblings. Lauren, 16, quick and vivid, a teenager halfway between a laugh and an opinion. The photos chosen for the programs weren't accidents. They were the faces their people wanted to carry forward. No headlines, no courtroom standing, just light, eyes, the posture of a life moving forward. At the schools, the adults who had taught Emily and Lauren walked into classrooms and did something harder than any test. Keep order with kindness while answering questions that had no tidy end. Counselors set up spaces that didn't look like offices. Friends built small memorials, the way teenagers always do. Locker decorations that lasted longer than they were supposed to. A bench, a yearbook page that taught younger students how to say the names without turning them into legend. Sean, now the center of more attention than any child wants, had to grow in 2 directions at once. Forward, because childhood doesn't pause, and inward, because what he saw and did that night is a weight no one else can carry for him. A community can only try to make sure he never has to carry it alone. The case itself didn't stop at sentencing. Capital punishment brings with it a maintenance schedule of appeals, each with its own vocabulary. Direct appeal, post-conviction review, state habeas, federal habeas, and each designed to trade speed for accuracy when a life is at stake. Lawyers read transcripts until their margins filled with notes. Clerks checked citations until the ink ran thin. The Kansas Supreme Court reviewed everything the trial court had done and left the verdict and sentence where the jury had put them. Then the argument that had always been destined for a higher court made its way to Washington with a clean caption: Kaler versus Kansas. At stake was a question that sounded abstract until you put it next to the facts. Does due process require states to offer a right and wrong insanity defense, one that lets a defendant avoid conviction if mental illness left him unable to appreciate the moral wrongfulness of his acts? Kansas had chosen a different path in the 1990s. You can present mental disease evidence to negate intent, mens rea, and you can present it in mitigation at sentencing. But you cannot secure a full acquittal simply because you couldn't tell right from wrong. In 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court, 6 justices to 3, said the Constitution allows that choice. States may structure insanity narrowly. Due process doesn't freeze any one historical test into national law. The ruling didn't change a minute of what happened in Burlingame. It did make the Kaler case a marker in criminal law textbooks, A family's worst day turned into a footnote about how America defines responsibility. No ruling, high or low, does the quiet work. That belongs to neighbors and pastors and friends who remember to show up after the casseroles stop. It belongs to the slow re-knitting of ordinary things. A holiday table set with an extra candle. A Christmas tree decorated with ornaments that used to have a particular person's job. A birthday observed in a way that lets grief be present without being the only guest. It looks like a school counselor who keeps Sean's file close, not because he is a case, but because he is a kid who deserves a long string of normal days. It looks like a coach who finds a place on a team for someone who needs to run as much as he needs to talk. It looks like a church that lets silence be part of a service and doesn't rush to fill it with answers. There was, too, the adult conversation communities have when the worst thing is close to home. How to notice danger when it wears a suit and a reputation. How to read control, isolation, and humiliation as risk factors instead of quirks. How to help families set boundaries that are more than paperwork. People closest to Karen spoke carefully about the line she had tried to draw and how that line was crossed in a single night. Advocates used the case to teach without exploiting. If threats escalate, take them literally. If you make a plan to leave, make it with people who know how to help. If you're a friend, keep checking in even when the separation looks settled. Because separation can be the most dangerous phase. Law enforcement wrote its own lessons into training binders. First-in officers practiced the discipline of asking the one question that matters when seconds do. Who did this? And respecting the legal weight of a dying declaration. Investigators documented how to read a house for sequence, how bullet paths, cartridge placement, and blood patterns turn rooms into a narrative that survives cross-examination. Prosecutors who teach younger lawyers used this file to show what premeditation looks like when it isn't theatrical. A night chosen for who would be home, a weapon chosen for lethality, a route through rooms, an exit, a missing rifle that reads like intent even when the metal is gone. As appeals ticked on, people asked the question that floats over every death penalty case. Will the sentence ever be carried out? Kansas rarely sets execution dates. Litigation is long by design. The state has executed few people in modern time. Families learned to answer the question by declining to answer it. What they could say, what they needed to say, was simpler. There was a verdict. The law acknowledged the gravity. The names of the people they loved would not be reduced to the line that comes after a defendant's name in a caption. Time changed the way the town remembered. The house in Burlingame returned to being a house to everyone except the people who needed it to remain a landmark in their hearts. New families moved to streets that held stories they only half knew. Teachers retired. New ones read old memos about how to handle anniversaries gently. Police promoted, but the deputy who heard Lauren's words carried them into every call where a voice might matter. The story left the front page and settled into the place where communities store the guidance they hope never to need again. If you're looking for a single moral that fits in a short sentence, there isn't one. There are several, and they sit beside each other without competing. Hold the victims at the center. Take threats seriously. Teach the difference between motive and intent. Accept that mental illness can explain without excusing. Honor the survivor's privacy as much as their courage. Say the names, and keep saying them, not as an incantation against evil, but as an act of ordinary fidelity to people who should have been allowed to go on being ordinary. So say them now in the order the family would: Dorothy, Karen, Emily, Lauren, and remember Sean, not as a witness or a headline, but as a boy who ran for help and kept a truth alive long enough for a jury to recognize it. The law did its part, imperfect and earnest. The rest belongs to the living. To take care with each other, to plan for safety as carefully as we plan for holidays, and to make sure the way we tell this story never gives more weight to the man who ended lives than to the lives he ended. When a capital case leaves the headlines, the work that matters doesn't stop. It just gets quieter. Files move on carts. Calendars acquire reminders no one else can read. People return to jobs and schools and kitchens that feel the same but aren't. That's where the Kaler case lives now, half in the record, half in the habits a community chose to keep. Start with the people who learned the hardest lessons first. Friends and family of Dorothy, Karen, Emily, and Lauren carried on in the only practical way grief allows, by putting one foot in front of the other and deciding which parts of the past to set gently on a shelf and which to hold every day. They learned the rhythm of anniversaries, how to plan for them, so the date doesn't arrive like a blow. They learned what to do when an unexpected song or scent opens a door in your chest. Step through, stay a minute, come back. They learned how to keep Sean's world large, new routines, safe people, spaces where he could be a kid without every adult in the room flinching for him. None of this shows up in law books. It shows up in durable kindness, rides, texts, invitations that don't make a show of themselves. The schools that knew the girls turned their shock into scaffolding. They kept a counselor's door open longer than budget spreadsheets prefer. Teachers who had graded Emily's essays and laughed at Lauren's timing passed along small rituals to the colleagues who came after them. How to talk about hard things without turning a classroom into a memorial. How to mark a date without recruiting children into other people's grief. How to recognize when a student is carrying more than homework. These are not dramatic acts. They are the quiet mechanics of a place that has decided to be safe on purpose. Law enforcement and prosecutors recorded their lessons too. The first-in deputy who heard Lauren's words taught younger officers the discipline of the question. Ask it softly, ask it once, and hold the answer with the seriousness it deserves. Crime scene teams used the case in training to show how you turn a family home into a narrative. How casings, bullet paths, and blood patterns can explain sequence without making spectacle. Prosecutors turned the file into a case study in premeditation that isn't theatrical. A night chosen for who would be present, a weapon suited to speed, an exit plan that presumes time to dispose of evidence. They taught the difference between motive, a story people tell themselves, and intent, the decision the law cares about. Beyond the county line, domestic violence advocates used the case to improve the net that catches families in danger. They leaned into the hard parts. That separation can be the most dangerous stage. That threats escalate and should be taken literally. That control and humiliation are not moods, but risk factors. That safety plans must be written with professionals who know how to hide a plan inside everyday life. Police and advocacy groups drilled together more often. Tabletop exercises for protective orders, protocols for welfare checks that don't telegraph themselves, scripts for friends who are worried but don't know what to say beyond, "Are you safe?" The courts did what courts do, maintained the case with paperwork and patience. In practical terms, that means the sentence is reviewed and re-reviewed, deadlines are met, and every claim is read with care because the law is obligated to be exact when a person's life is on the line. Attorneys on both sides live with the long half-lives of capital litigation. A motion here, a response there, a hearing set months out. People who ask, "Is it over yet?" get the honest answer. The verdict is final. The legal process is not meant to be swift. Families learn to let that truth sit beside the rest of their lives without letting it run the table. Kaler v. Kansas left a footprint wider than this case. Law schools teach it. Trial judges cite it when instructing juries. Legislatures use it as a reference when they revisit their own insanity statutes. But in living rooms, the ruling's effect is less doctrinal and more practical. Defense teams tailor mental health evidence to intent and mitigation. Prosecutors prepare to explain to juries how serious illness can coexist with purposeful action. Judges set a tone that permits compassion for illness without confusing it with an excuse under Kansas law. That balance is difficult under any light, but feels honest under this one. Policy rarely moves because of a single event, but cases like this provide momentum. Counties looked again at how protection from abuse orders are served and enforced, how officers document threats that don't come with bruises, how dispatchers flag addresses with histories so responding units arrive with context and caution. Some departments added a simple practice that seems small until it saves a life: callbacks after a domestic call, not just the next day but again a week later, with a human voice on the line and numbers for help repeated out loud. Communities also chose how to remember. There were scholarships and small funds established without press conferences. There were holiday food drives done in a name, because names matter more when they're attached to help. There were garden corners planted where someone could sit and be left alone. There were church services that let silence take up more space than words. The point wasn't to build a monument to a crime. It was to thread the victims' names into ordinary good so that their memory keeps making days livable for people they never met. Underneath all of this is an ethic the case reinforced: keep victims at the center. That affects how stories are told, how anniversaries are noted, how officials speak at podiums. It looks like reporters who lead with Dorothy, Karen, Emily, and Lauren, not the defendant's resume. It looks like police briefings that resist lurid detail and ask for what's needed. It looks like schools and churches protecting the privacy of the living even when curiosity knocks loudly. It is a set of small refusals. Refuse to make a villain the protagonist. Refuse to turn tragedy into content. Refuse to let a community be defined by its worst day when its best days are the answer. If there's a single practice to carry forward, it's checking in. On the friend who says she's fine but whose world keeps getting smaller. On the colleague whose life seems to have collapsed around one grievance. On the kid who starts joking about violence and doesn't stop. None of those signals is proof. Together, they can be enough to ask better questions, to put resources within reach, to slow a slide before gravity takes over. The lesson is not paranoia, it is attention. The law will continue to do what it can: maintain the record, test the sentence, keep faith with the careful process a death case demands. The rest belongs to the living. Keep the rituals that make families sturdy. Leave room at tables and in schedules for people who are rebuilding. Treat safety as something you plan on purpose, not something you beg for after the fact. Teach children that asking for help is not a weakness, and giving it is not an intrusion. This is as close to a conclusion as a story like this allows. 4 people should be alive. 1 boy survived and told the truth. A jury listened and answered. The appeals clarified the law without undoing the facts. A town chose to be decent after the cameras left. That is not triumph. It is steadiness. And steadiness, repeated, is how communities outlast the nights that try to unmake them. If you want true cases told with care and the victims at the center, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episode. In the comments, honor their names: Dorothy White, Karen Kaler, Emily Kaler, and Lauren Kaler. And send strength to Sean. Share responsibly. Your support helps us keep making thoughtful, respectful storytelling.